The year was 1865. The land was raw, untamed, a place where men sought fortune and met death in equal measure. The sky above stretched endlessly, painted in dying hues of red and gold as the sun sank behind the distant hills. In the heart of this vast and merciless frontier, the Bennett family moved westward in a caravan of wagons, their dreams stitched together with hope and naivety. Eliza Bennett sat in the back of the wagon, her fingers gripping the edge of her shawl as the cool evening air brushed against her skin. She was 18, her life thus far confined to the safety of small town walls and whispered warnings about the wild land ahead. Her father, John Bennett, had reassured her time and again this was the future. This was where they would build something lasting. But the frontier did not belong to them. The first sign of danger was the wind, how it shifted, carrying an eerie stillness that made the horses uneasy. Then came the distant rumble of hooves, barely distinguishable from the natural sounds of the prairie. The men in the caravan tensed. The crack of a rifle shattered the silence. Chaos erupted. Eliza was thrown forward as the wagon jerked to a halt. Shouts! Gunfire. The air filled with the acrid smell of smoke. Figures on horseback surged through the grass, their war cries splitting the sky. The Cheyenne had come like ghosts, swift and merciless. Her father's voice rang out, "Eliza, run!" But she couldn't move. Her body felt frozen, paralyzed by the horror unfolding before her. She saw her mother clutching her little brother to her chest, her father raising his rifle. He fired. A warrior fell from his horse. Another took his place. A blur of movement. Men pulling settlers from their wagons, steel flashing, bodies dropping. She saw her father fall. Her mother's scream was swallowed by the chaos. Something rough yanked her backward. Hands. Strong, unyielding. She struggled, her breath coming in gasps as she was lifted onto a horse. The ground blurred beneath her as the animal surged forward, carrying her away for the only life she had ever known. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the battle was over. The survivors were few, some taken, most left to the mercy of the buzzards. The caravan was reduced to smoldering wood and lifeless bodies, a monument to the ruthlessness of the land. The war party rode hard into the night, the cries of the dying fading behind them. Eliza didn't know how long they traveled. Time became meaningless, measured only in the pounding of hooves and the sting of the wind against her tear-streaked face. Her wrists were bound, her dress torn, her mind caught in the space between terror and disbelief. When they finally slowed, the warriors spoke among themselves in a language she couldn't understand. Their laughter was sharp, mocking. She shrank against the man who held her, though his grip neither tightened nor loosened. He was silent, unlike the others. He did not revel in the bloodshed. At last, the village came into view, a cluster of lodges nestled in a valley, hidden from the prying eyes of the world. Fires flickered, casting long shadows against the earth. Women and children emerged, their expressions shifting from curiosity to caution as they saw the captives. Eliza was pulled from the horse and forced to her knees. A man stepped forward, his presence commanding. He was not like the warriors who had taken her. His gaze was sharp, thoughtful. The others fell silent as he approached. Chief Takota. He studied her, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he turned to Walk-In, the warrior who had led the raid. "You defied my orders," Takota said. His voice was steady, but there was something dangerous beneath it. Walk-In smirked. "You hesitate too much, Chief. We must show strength, or we will be swept away like dust in the wind." Takota's gaze flickered toward the other captives. Two men, older, wounded. A child who clung to his mother, both trembling. Then back to Eliza. "What do you plan to do with them?" Takota asked. Walk-In shrugged. "Kill the men. Sell the rest." A muscle in Takota's jaw tensed. The old ways were shifting. The war with the white men had turned brother against brother, warrior against warrior. But this was not war. This was slaughter. He knelt in front of Eliza, his expression unreadable. "Do you understand me?" Her breath caught in her throat. She nodded. "What is your name?" She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Eliza." Takota exhaled slowly, then rose to his feet. She is not to be harmed. Wakin scoffed. And what would you have us do? Return her to the people who take our land? She is no threat. She is a symbol of our weakness. Wakin stepped closer. Your father would never have hesitated. Takota's expression darkened. My father is dead. Silence settled over the crowd. The weight of the unspoken war between them hung heavy in the air. Finally, Takota turned away. The captives stay, he said. No harm will come to them until I decide otherwise. Wakin's eyes burned with fury, but he said nothing. He had pushed as far as he dared. For now, Takota's gaze lingered on Eliza once more before he turned and walked away. That night, she sat in the lodge where she'd been placed, her wrists still raw from the bindings. The firelight flickered, casting strange shapes on the walls. She was alive. For now, outside, Takota stood at the edge of the village, staring into the darkness. His people whispered behind him. Some called him wise. Others called him a coward. Tomorrow, he would have to choose which he would be. Night wrapped the village in a hushed stillness. The only sound the occasional crackle of fire and the distant howl of a coyote. Inside the lodge where Eliza was kept, the air was thick with the earthy scent of smoke and animal hides. She sat curled in the farthest corner, arms wrapped around her knees, listening. Every breath she took felt stolen. Every heartbeat a drum against her ribs. She did not belong here. Outside, men spoke in low voices. Occasionally, a woman's laughter drifted through the air. The village was alive in its own quiet way, oblivious of the terror curling inside her chest. She glanced at the entrance, where a guard had been placed. Her captors did not trust her yet, but someone had. Chief Takota's eyes had been different, not empty like the others, not burning with hatred. She had seen the hesitation in him, the conflict. He had spared her life when the others would not have. But why? And for how long? The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. A storm was coming. She shivered, though not from the cold. If she stayed, she would be sold, or worse. There was only one choice. Escape. The night deepened. The village settled into sleep. The guard outside her lodge had shifted position twice, but he had not moved away. She had waited long enough. Carefully, she reached for the sharp edge of a broken wooden bowl near the fire pit. Her wrists were still sore from where they had been bound, but she gritted her teeth and began sawing at the rope that tied her ankles. Minutes passed. The fibers frayed. A final pull, and they snapped. She barely breathed as she rose to her feet, every muscle tensed. She pressed herself against the hide wall of the lodge, listening. No sound of movement outside. Step by step, she edged toward the entrance. She crouched, peering through the flap. The guard sat near the fire, his head bobbing slightly. Asleep. Now. She slipped out, bare feet against the cold earth, her pulse hammering. She darted behind a stack of wood, pausing only long enough to listen. The night seemed to stretch endlessly. Then movement. A voice muttered something in the darkness. She froze. A shadow passed near the fire, a warrior stretching his arms before stepping into another lodge. She forced herself to breathe. Stay low. Stay quiet. The horses. That was her chance. If she could steal one, she might make it far enough before they realized she was gone. She moved swiftly now, crouching behind a row of drying pelts, weaving through the village with careful precision. Every sound made her heart lurch. She could see them now, half a dozen horses tied near the edge of the encampment. If she could just... A hand clamped over her mouth. Panic surged, but before she could twist away, a low voice rumbled against her ear. Quiet. Takota. Her breath hitched. He slowly removed his hand, his grip shifting to her wrist. His touch was firm, but not cruel. He didn't drag her back, didn't call for the others. Instead, he exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You are not safe here, he said quietly. But if you leave alone, you will die. She swallowed, throat dry. Then let me go. He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. They will come after you, he said. Wakin will not stop. I'd rather die running then. Her voice broke, the weight of everything crashing down at once. I can't stay here. Takota studied her for a long moment. his expression unreadable. Then, to her utter shock, he let go of her wrist and turned toward the horses. She didn't move as he untied one, stroking its mane to keep it calm. Then he handed her the reins. "Go," he said. She didn't understand. "You're letting me leave?" "I am saving your life." Eliza hesitated, but instinct screamed at her to move. She climbed onto the horse's back, gripping the reins tightly. Dakota stepped back, his face shadowed in the dim firelight. "Ride west until you find the river," he instructed. "Follow it." Her chest tightened. "What will happen to you?" Dakota glanced toward the village. "They will know soon enough." She didn't have time to argue. She turned the horse and urged it forward, the animal breaking into a swift gallop. The night blurred around her, wind lashing against her skin. She didn't look back. The first alarm rose moments later. Shouts, the pounding of hooves. The chase had begun. Eliza urged the horse faster, her fingers burning from gripping the reins too tightly. The night was no longer silent. It was alive with the furious cries of warriors, the distant beating of war drums. The river. She had to find the river. The landscape stretched endlessly ahead, a sea of darkness broken only by the occasional silhouette of trees. The sound of hooves behind her grew louder. They were gaining. A sharp whistle split the air. The horse beneath her jerked violently, its muscles seizing as an arrow embedded itself in its flank. Eliza barely had time to react before the animal stumbled, collapsing beneath her. Pain exploded through her shoulder as she hit the ground, rolling through the tall grass. The breath was knocked from her lungs. Stars burst in her vision. Footsteps. She tried to push herself up, but hands grabbed her, yanking her roughly to her feet. She struggled, kicking, clawing, but there were too many. Laughter. Watkins' voice. "Did you think you could outrun us?" He shoved her to the ground. Dirt filled her mouth. "Foolish girl," he sneered. "And to think our chief let you go." He turned to the others. Dakota's weakness has cost him his place. Eliza struggled, but the grip on her arms was unyielding. The warriors spoke among themselves, arguing. Some wanted to kill her now. Others saw her as leverage. The sky rumbled. The storm had arrived. Then another sound, hooves, fast and unrelenting. The warriors turned just as a figure emerged from the darkness. "Dakota." He rode hard, his expression carved from stone, a rifle in hand. The warriors hesitated, but Wakin only smiled. "You would fight your own people for this girl?" Dakota's voice was quiet, yet it carried through the night. "I would fight any man who has forgotten honor." Wakin's smirk faltered. Dakota dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. The rain began to fall, heavy and cold, soaking the earth beneath them. Eliza's breath came in ragged gasps as Dakota stepped forward, locking eyes with Wakin. "She is not yours to take," Dakota said. "She is not yours to save." Wakin's fingers tightened around the hilt of his knife. The storm raged. The tension hung thick in the air. Then, in a single breath, Wakin lunged. Dakota was faster. The fight was brutal, raw. Fists met flesh. Bones cracked. The others stood back, watching. This was no ordinary fight. It was a challenge, a battle for dominance. Dakota struck hard, sending Wakin staggering. The warrior spat blood, snarling, but Dakota did not relent. He dodged the next attack, driving his knee into Wakin's gut. Wakin fell to his knees, panting. Dakota did not finish him. He turned instead to the warriors. "Is this who you would follow?" Silence. Wakin coughed, fury in his gaze, but he did not rise. Eliza, still breathless, met Dakota's eyes. "We leave," he said simply. No one stopped them. Dakota helped her onto his horse, mounting behind her. With one last glance at his people, he turned away. Together, they rode into the storm. The storm followed them deep into the wilderness, the rain slashing against their skin, the wind howling like a wounded beast. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the earth beneath the pounding hooves of Dakota's horse. Eliza clung to him, her fingers curled tightly into the soaked fabric of his tunic. She couldn't see where they were going, only that they were moving fast, the landscape a blur of shifting shadows. Hours passed before Dakota finally slowed the horse. Its breath labored from the relentless ride. The storm had begun to wane, though a fine mist still clung to the air, curling like ghosts around the trees. Eliza's body ached, every muscle stiff from exhaustion and cold. She didn't protest when Dakota dismounted and reached for her, steadying her as she slid from the saddle. They had stopped in a dense thicket, sheltered by towering pines. The ground was slick with mud, the scent of damp earth thick in the air. Dakota pulled the reins over the horse's head, whispering something low and soothing as he led the animal toward a rocky outcrop. Eliza shivered, hugging her arms around herself. What now? Dakota glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. We make camp. Rest. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't offer words of comfort. But he moved with quiet purpose, pulling supplies from his saddlebag, gathering dry branches from beneath a fallen tree. When he struck flint to steel, the fire sputtered, then caught, its glow casting flickering shadows across his face. Eliza sank down near the flames, stretching her hands toward the warmth. Her dress was still damp, clinging to her skin, but at least the shivering had stopped. She watched as Dakota remove his rifle, setting it carefully within reach before he turned his attention to the horse, checking its legs, its hooves. He had risked everything to save her. His people would never welcome him back now. He had thrown away his place, his home. And for what? Eliza swallowed, her throat thick. Why did you do it? Dakota didn't look at her. You would not have survived. That's not what I meant. She hesitated, searching his face. You didn't have to come after me. He was silent for a long moment, his hands moving with practiced ease as he loosened the horse's saddle. Then, finally, he spoke. There are lines that should not be crossed. Walken forgot that. She studied him in the firelight. He was unlike any man she had ever known. Steady, restrained, yet there was something beneath the surface, something guarded. A man torn between two worlds. A gust of wind rustled the trees, sending a fresh wave of rain through the branches. She shifted closer to the fire, rubbing warmth back into her arms. What will you do now? Dakota exhaled slowly, staring into the flames. Go west. West. The same direction she had been trying to reach before everything had gone wrong. She pressed her lips together, considering. My family, she hesitated, the words catching her throat. My mother and brother. If they survived, they would have gone west, too. Dakota glanced at her then, his dark eyes unreadable. You wish to find them? A lump formed in her throat. I have to. For the first time, something flickered across his face. An understanding, a recognition of loss. He gave a slight nod. Then we go west. Relief surged through her, though it was quickly replaced by something heavier. The journey ahead would not be easy. They ate in silence, sharing what little food Dakota had. A strip of dried venison, a handful of berries. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As the fire crackled and the night stretched on, exhaustion settled deep into Eliza's bones. She leaned back against the rough bark of a tree, her eyes growing heavy. She didn't expect to sleep, but she did. She woke to the distant call of a wolf. The fire had burned low, reduced to glowing embers. The night was thick with mist, the air damp and still. For a moment, she wasn't sure what had woken her. Then she saw him. Dakota sat a short distance away, his back to her, his rifle resting across his knees. He hadn't slept. He had been watching, guarding. Something warm and unfamiliar stirred in her chest. Slowly, she pushed herself up. Dakota? He turned slightly, his gaze sharp even in the dim light. You should rest, she murmured. He studied her for a long moment before exhaling through his nose, something like quiet amusement ghosting across his face. Someone must keep watch. She hesitated, then stood, stepping closer. Then let me. His brows lifted slightly, as if the idea was absurd. But after a moment, he shifted, moving aside just enough to make room for her near the fire. She sat down beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. They didn't speak. They just watched the night together, listening to the quiet sounds of the wilderness, breathing in the same cool air. She didn't know what lay ahead, But for the first time since the raid, she didn't feel completely alone. Dawn bled slowly across the horizon, casting golden light over the endless expanse of wild plains. The night had passed in uneasy silence, but Eliza knew it had only been borrowed time. The moment Dakota had turned against his own people, a reckoning had been set in motion. They would come. It was only a question of when. Dakota stood at the edge of their makeshift camp, his expression carved from stone as he surveyed the land beyond. His rifle rested in the crook of his arm, his body taut with quiet vigilance. He had slept little, but exhaustion did not show in his movements. He was prepared. Eliza's fingers curled into the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The fire had long since died, its embers smothered beneath damp earth. They could not afford to be seen, could not leave any sign of their passing. She rose to her feet, stepping lightly over the uneven ground. "They'll come for you," she said softly. Dakota did not turn. "Yes." Her throat tightened. "What will you do?" He was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he turned to her, his dark eyes unreadable. "Fight, if I must." A shiver ran through her, but not from the cold. She had seen the way Walken looked at him before they had fled, the fury in his eyes. This was not just about her anymore. This was about pride, power, betrayal. Dakota had defied his own blood, and in doing so, he had painted a target on his back. Eliza squared her shoulders, stepping closer. "Then we fight together." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, crossed his face. Then, slowly, he gave a small nod. They rode hard through the morning, the wind lashing against them as they cut across the open plains. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills giving way to distant mountains. It should have felt free. Instead, it felt exposed. By midday, they reached a narrow canyon, its towering rock walls offering temporary shelter. The air was dry, thick with the scent of sun-baked earth. Dakota pulled his horse to a stop, scanning the landscape behind them. Eliza followed his gaze, heart pounding. The land lay quiet, too quiet. Then, in the distance, a dark cluster of figures emerged over the ridge. Her breath caught. "They found us." Dakota didn't react at first, his expression eerily calm. Then, without a word, he dismounted, reaching for his rifle. Eliza slid from her horse, her fingers trembling as she reached for the knife Dakota had given her the night before. She had never killed a man. She didn't know if she could. Dakota moved swiftly, gathering stones, arranging them into a crude barrier along the canyon wall. A defense. A last stand. The riders came fast, their horses kicking up clouds of dust, their war cries splitting the silence. There were 7 of them, and at their head rode Walken. Dakota chambered round. "Stay behind me." Eliza's pulse thundered. "I can fight." A faint smirk touched his lips. "Then fight." The first shot rang out, sharp as a whip crack. One of the riders jerked backward, tumbling from his horse. Chaos erupted. Dakota fired again, his movements fluid, precise. He dropped another warrior before the rest could reach them. Eliza pressed herself against a rock, gripping her knife so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could hear the pounding of hooves, the furious shouts, the clash of steel. Then Walken was there. He leapt from his horse, landing in a crouch. His eyes locked onto Dakota, filled with nothing but cold rage. "You should have stayed with your people," he spat. Dakota didn't flinch. "My people are not murderers." Walken lunged. The two men collided in a brutal clash of fists and steel. Walken swung his knife in a vicious arc, but Dakota caught his wrist, twisting hard. The blade clattered to the ground. Walken snarled, driving his knee into Dakota's ribs. The force sent him staggering, but he recovered quickly, countering with a swift strike to Walken's jaw. Blood sprayed against the canyon wall. Eliza barely had time to react before another warrior charged toward her. She ducked, narrowly avoiding the swing of his tomahawk. Survival was instinct now. She slashed out with her knife, catching his arm. He roared in pain, but didn't stop. He grabbed her wrist, twisting sharply. She cried out, the knife slipping from her grasp. Panic surged, but she refused to go down without a fight. She drove her knee into his stomach, wrenching free as he stumbled back. A gunshot cracked through the air. The warrior jerked, his body seizing before he collapsed. Eliza turned breathless. Dakota stood behind her, rifle still raised. His chest heaved, sweat and blood streaking his face. Only Walken remained. The chief's former second-in-command staggered his feet, his breath ragged. His face was bruised, his lips split, but his hatred burned as fiercely as ever. "You have no place left, Dakota," he spat. "No home, no tribe, and for what?" His gaze flickered to Eliza. For her? Dakota said nothing. Walken's grip tightened on his remaining blade. He lunged. Dakota didn't move, didn't even blink. He sidestepped at the last second, twisting Walken's momentum against him. The warrior stumbled forward, off balance, and Dakota struck. The knife found its mark, sinking deep into Walken's chest. His eyes widened, a strangled breath escaping his lips. For a moment he swayed, disbelief etched across his face. Then, slowly, he fell. Silence. The dust settled. The wind carried away the last echoes of battle. Eliza's breath came in short, uneven gasps. Her hands shook, her heart a wild thing in her chest. Dakota stepped back, his expression unreadable as he watched the life drain from Walken's eyes. It was over. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, at last, Dakota turned to her. "You are free now." Eliza swallowed hard. "And you?" His gaze drifted toward the horizon. "I will find my own path." Something inside her twisted. "Come with me?" Dakota hesitated, but then, slowly, he shook his head. "Your people will not accept me." Eliza stepped forward. "Then we make our own place." His eyes met hers, searching, and for the first time in a long while, hope flickered in the depths of his gaze. The past was behind them. The future was unwritten. Together, they rode toward it.